So describe a little bit how they started that and how they intentionally did things to cause ranchers not to be able to do business.
With the AUM.
Okay. Again, ranchers had traditional numbers of how many cattle they run on the range. Let's say you run 1,100 head. They would do things like suspend AUMs. In other words, they can't take the right away, and they realize that, but they would suspend them so you can't use them. Now, I don't know where they got any type of authority to do such a thing, but the ranchers, not knowing any better, would, and they did this to ranches across the country. They would suspend, say, 50%. So now you can only run 550 head instead of 1,100 head. So in other words, your business is immediately cut in half.
But again, like you said, who gave them the authority to do that? Did the Congress pass some kind of law?
No, and that's the problem, though. Ranchers have been involved with the BLM for so long, and the BLM had been involved with the ranchers for so long, that the BLM began to assume authority that they didn't have. And the ranchers, because of a generational gap, the original ranchers had kind of passed away, and the younger ranchers didn't realize their own rights, and assumed that the Bureau of Land Management had this authority because they didn't know any better. So it was an education problem.
Oh.
It was what did our founding fathers say? You cannot expect to be ignorant and free. This is the grand example of that. Because of their ignorance of their own rights, they were losing them. Okay? Because of the ignorance of their own rights, they didn't realize they had them. And so now the Bureau of Land Management is managing these ranchers to the point to damaging their livelihood, and that, those original 50% cuts, cuts a business, cuts a ranch right in half, and then they made additional cuts and restrictions where they would begin to say, okay, you can only have your cattle on this area at this time of the year, or that area this other time of the year, and then they would expect them to take them off, and there's lots of work involved, lots of stress on the cattle, and then they wouldn't let them put them back out. We're seeing this very same thing happen on other ranches right today. Right today, they've developed those tactics. Now, they've used excuses such as different environmental reasons, different endangered species. They would claim that the cattle are doing damage to this or that overgrazing had been taking place, etc., etc. And whether it be true or not made no difference to the BLM. And a good example of that is on our range, they used the excuse that cattle were damaging desert tortoise and desert tortoise habitat. And so they ordered us that we remove our cattle from the range. Some of the other ranchers in the area said, wait a second, you have no scientific proof that the cattle are doing any damage to the desert tortoise. And so they actually took them to task on that, filed a lawsuit against the Bureau of Land Management, and it went through the whole court case, and the ranchers won. BLM had no scientific proof that the cattle were doing damage to the tortoise or tortoise habitat. So the BLM, this didn't slow the BLM down at all. All they did was change their wording in their reasons for removing the cattle from that the cattle are doing damage to the cattle may do damage. In other words, by saying may, it's a possibility, but it carried no burden of proof. And with that new wording, they demanded all the cattle be removed.
So the Congress didn't make this. The BLM themselves just made the regulation.
Yes, and that's another big problem with the whole bureaucracy. And I'm not just talking the Bureau of Land Management, I'm talking the whole bureaucracies across everything, across the United States, is they make their own rules, they enforce their own law rules, and they have judges that back them up. Okay, so in other words, they have combined the three powers that are supposed to be separate. Now, a true law has to go through the House, the Senate, and pass both of them, and then be signed by the President of the United States. Or on a state level, same thing, has to go through their different branches of legislation and be signed by the governor to become a true law. In the bureaucracies, they don't have to go through any of that process. They just write up a new rule, put it on their books, slam bam, it's done. And they call that code. That's the difference between law and code.
Statutes.
Okay? Law and code. Law has to go through a legislative body, which, by the way, the legislatures are chosen and elected by the people. The governor or the president, he is an elected position. It has to go through those branches of government. And then they're interpreted and enforced by the judicial and the executive branches. Okay, so the three branches are separate, the three powers are separate. The laws have to go through that process, but code doesn't go through that process. The codes are written by internal personnel that are not elected, that did not consult with the people, and then they're enforced by their own agency, and then the federal judges back those up. And so the three branches of government have been combined, and that is un-American.